When you start practicing arpeggios, then usually you'll start working with positions, and that's a great way to have a good overview of all the chord tones in an area of the neck, but it's quite difficult to use that in a solo in a way that actually sounds good. So in this video I'm going to help you fix that so that you can play better solos and use the material that you're practicing and not waste your time when you're practicing arpeggios. My name is Larsen, learn jazz, make music. Most of us start by learning arpeggios in complete positions like this one. And here we do, of course, have a really good overview of the arpeggio, so we can see where we have the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. And because we're practicing the arpeggio as this big chunk with a lot of notes, then it's kind of difficult to really use that when you're playing music. And in fact, very often you just end up running up and down the arpeggio and you get a line like this. A few things are missing with this. We have a big chunk with a lot of notes, and that means that it's not very flexible, and it's also very difficult to get it to fit with the things that we just played before we were playing the line with the arpeggio. And finally, we end up just running up and down the arpeggio, and that makes for kind of a boring, predictable melody. There are some good things as well, because you are actually playing the changes and you also know how to play the arpeggio, so it's not all bad. So let's fix this, because there is actually a way that you can start practicing the arpeggios and work on making lines with them so that it's actually going to be a part of your playing, and it's easier than you think. And then later I'm going to show you an exercise that really made a huge difference for me in terms of using arpeggios and getting started playing bebop lines with them. In the first example, it's clear that this is a situation where you know how to play the arpeggio, but you can't really make music with it. And a part of learning how to make music with an arpeggio is, of course, also to just understand it and place it in the context where it's found. So when you're improvising, then you want to play arpeggio notes, but you don't only want to play the arpeggio. You also want to mix in the other notes in the scale. So that would be the scale that fits that chord. Another important part of this is that you're also playing over a chord, but there are other chords in the progression, and you want to connect to the chord tones, so the arpeggios on those chords, and they are also found within the scale. So it's really useful to place the arpeggio in a scale. So if we look at the C major 7 arpeggio, then you can actually play this C major scale around it. Right now this is useful for just seeing how the arpeggio sits in the scale and where it's coming from. But later in the video I'm also going to show you how you can use this to create some really great lines that are not just running up and down the arpeggio. To get started using the arpeggios, then it makes sense to not use the entire position, simply because then you're going to become a little bit more free and you have an easier time making melodies that actually make sense. And if you start checking out jazz solos like this Charlie Parker solo, then you'll also see that most of the time in jazz we're actually using 1 octave arpeggios, and using larger arpeggios is not nearly as common. So let's go from a full position to this much simpler 1 octave arpeggio. With this set of notes, then it's a lot easier to try out different combinations and see what kind of melodies you can make. And if you just experiment a little bit, then you get melodies like this. And with these examples, I think it's clear that you can add more phrasing, you can make more music, and it's just a lot easier to make some melodies that you can actually use in a solo. Now you can start adding the scale notes around the arpeggio when you're making lines with it. And I think this is really where you can start making some great melodies and some more interesting lines. Something like this. And you can see here how the scale notes are sort of inserted between the chord tones and are just sort of filling up and creating a bit of variation, so that you're not only playing the arpeggio as a melody all the time. And here you can see how that works, and you can create a full line that sounds great, not even using the entire arpeggio or the entire octave that we've limited ourselves to. I think it's a good idea to practice arpeggios in a position, because you get a really solid overview of where the chord tones are, and of course if you also connect it to the scale, then you kind of have the notes that you need to target when you're improvising, and that's just going to make you play stronger lines that really follow the harmony a lot better. Besides doing that, it's of course also important that you really spend some time composing material, making lines so that you figure out how to actually make music with this material, because otherwise it's just going to be these static blocks that you can't really do a lot with. And the way I showed you how to do that in this video, where you're limiting yourself down to a single octave, is really useful for this. You have to keep in mind that in the position that we covered, then I only used the upper octave, but actually you also have a lower octave. So if you're already familiar with this arpeggio, then you can try and explore that lower octave and see what you can make with it. One of the exercises that really helped me getting started using arpeggios and also creating my own bebop vocabulary was practicing the arpeggios in the scale, so what you might call diatonic arpeggios. And if you want to check out a video where I talk about this, because I think this is a great exercise where you can really connect the things that you play in the scale and the arpeggios with the chords that you're improvising over, then check out this video where I'm going over how that works and also giving you some solid information on how to make bebop lines, different ways to use arpeggios over chords, and a lot of other stuff.